think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building as they're coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back. We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
In the fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
You don't need a science degree or a PhD to follow James's lecture, because then he went on to teach physics A-level to kids at Doncaster College, and that's the level that this talk is at, and that is the whole point of James's talk, is that anybody doing A-level at Doncaster College should be able to see that the official story of 9/11 is a load of rubbish. James.
Hello. Right then, well, it is A-level that I'm going to be dealing with. It's kind of, A-level makes it sound harder than it is. Maybe it's probably more sort of AS level that we'll be dealing with. And the reason why, I just want to mention why physics is actually important to this whole debate, really. What I'm going into is the physics of the collapse of the tower specifically, and why deal with the physics of it? Well, two reasons really. The first reason is that, in actual fact, that's what FEMA and NIST were dealing with, because the material evidence, of course, was shifted away. So we have this, here we've got Bill Manning of Fire Engineering magazine, and what he's saying is basically he's complaining that all the forensic analysis can't be done. So he says it's a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces. So this is January 2002. This is just a few months before the FEMA report on the building collapse.
What's FEMA?
FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who were the first people to look at, to do the investigation, but they basically helped to clear it all up or cover it all up or whatever. So that's one reason. The other reason is that, of course, if there is a problem with the physics of what we're being told, then we can be sure that there's a very serious problem indeed, because physics doesn't lie. If the physics is wrong, then we can be sure that there's a problem. So, okay, so what I want to do, in a way, is do a kind of review of different approaches that people have taken looking into this, the physics of the collapse of these towers, and challenging the FEMA and the NIST analysis that came later. And there's basically these four different things that we can consider. The first one is conservation of linear momentum. Then there's conservation of energy. Then there's this question of the production of molten steel. And then finally, close to freefall collapse rates. And it's interesting that there's this talk of close to. We'll come to how close to later. So what I'm going to do is all these are linked in ways anyway. I'm going to move through them. And as we go down, we'll find that firstly, they get easier to understand, hopefully. And secondly, they become more and more important, I think, really. Okay, so I'm going to start with conservation of momentum. And this is the hardest one for me to explain to you, but basically the gist of it is, I'll start with the simplest idea, okay? If you have a pancake collapse, this is where one floor slams into another floor, and then there's two floors move together and slam into another floor, and so on. If we start with one floor and it hits the second floor, then basically at that point, there has to be conservation of momentum. And that means that if this floor's moving with a certain velocity, then when they two move off together, they have to have the same momentum, and therefore they have to have half the velocity. So there's a slowing at the point of collision. And then if you come to the next floor down, you get another slowing, although that slowing's a little bit less. It's actually the three will move off with 2/3 of whatever the two hit them. Okay? So what that tells you is then that you can't have free fall speeds if you've got this series of collisions. So this was one of the arguments that was put forward as to why the original FEMA analysis didn't add up, basically. But the problem with this is a number of things, I think. One problem with it is that FEMA never actually claimed that it was like one floor hitting another floor. What they claimed was it was a whole building above the impact zone, which is where the plane hit, collapsing and acting like a pile driver. And in that situation, this effect, because you've got so much momentum at the top, the effect's going to be a lot less. So the slowing's not going to be so significant. So that's one thing. So the argument, in a way, doesn't really challenge the free fall collapse particularly. But then there's another issue, the other way around, which is that actually, what about the structural forces? Because this idea of linear momentum assumes that basically these floors are just kind of floating there. If you like, if I turned it around this way, it'd be like a bunch of billiard balls and one hits the other. And it's like there's nothing actually stopping them falling. But of course there is. There's a whole building holding them up. So for various reasons, the conservation of momentum, I don't think is a good approach, really. Although it is relevant, it is interesting. But basically you need to know a lot about the collapse mechanism. And that's complicated. And in a way, what I was looking for when I started to look into this was a more simple way of dealing with it. And this certainly isn't a simple way. Okay, so this was the idea that occurred to me immediately. Was why deal with conservation of momentum, where basically you've got a series of events, because each time there's a collision between floors, that's an event, and you've got to do a calculation, essentially. Okay, why do that when you can look at the conservation of energy? Because with conservation of energy, if you know the energy at the start, then that must be the amount of energy you have at the end. So if you know basically how much energy you need to produce the results, you can see if you've got enough at the start. Okay, so you've got a test here that's quite simple, essentially. It's relatively easy to calculate the initial available energy. Okay, and I'll come to that. And this time, we don't have to worry about structural forces. Okay, it doesn't matter exactly how the building is destroyed in terms of dealing with conservation of energy. That's one of the beauties of using this law. So we don't need to know about that. We don't need to know about the collapse mechanism. However, the problem is that there is a complication, and that is we need to know how much energy we need to produce these results we find. And that means how much energy we need to pulverize all that concrete, because most of the building was broken to pieces into very small, fine bits of concrete. And we need to know how much energy is required to break apart all the girders or the bolts or whatever. I mean, these buildings were torn apart, and we need to know how much energy was required to do that. Now, it could be done. Somebody could do this, and I think people have, possibly. But I've never found an account that I'm really sure of. I don't know how to do it, okay? So I left that one. And I moved on to the next thing, which is this, the discovery of molten steel. And there's lots and lots of reports, eyewitness accounts and so on, that there was molten steel discovered underneath the towers, in the rubble of the towers, both 1 and 2 and also 7, I gather. Now, the question is, how could you have molten steel produced? Well, the obvious answer is that the fires must have produced the molten steel. But the catch is that the fires that we had were jet fuel at the hottest, and jet fuel can only burn at 1100 degrees C. That's what NIST say, so that's what the people investigating say. But to have molten steel, we need fires of 1500 degrees C. So we've obviously got a serious problem here. And I think this is the first real serious problem that's simple to understand, and you can say, hang on a minute, how can you possibly explain this? So I looked around, and you look at the debunking sites and see what they have to say. And one of the answers I came across was, maybe this steel wasn't melted just by heating, because you can't heat something hotter than the thing that's heating it. Okay, that's one of the rules of physics. But maybe it was heated further by work. So as the building was ripped apart, things were bent and crushed or whatever, and all these actions. If you take a piece of metal and you keep bending it around, it gets hotter and hotter. So maybe we could account for it in terms of the work done. So that was one suggestion. So I thought, okay, well, this is something I can actually have a go at. I can do my own calculation. I can have a bit of a stab at this one. I did what in physics you call a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Okay, this isn't like I couldn't present this at a conference, but it's the sort of thing physicists do when they have a coffee break. Okay, I tried to be fair about it. So I assume that I basically go for the upper estimate. Okay, so I assume that every last drop of energy, as it's all the energy that's in the building. Remember, it's all gravitational potential. After it's ripped the building apart, I assume that all of it actually heats the steel as well. So I take the gravitational potential energy, which is the thing on the left, the mass of the building times g, times h divided by 2. There's some assumptions here I'll come to in a minute. And I assume that all that goes into melting the steel. So I've got the mass of the steel, the specific heat capacity of steel, and the change in temperature. Okay, and I just wonder what change in temperature can I get if all of that potential energy goes into heating the steel. And just before I tell you the answer, by the way, here's why it's an upper limit estimate. Okay, one thing is that the actual centre of mass is below halfway, so I've exaggerated how much energy is available. NIST actually have their own value on the potential energy of the building. If I use their number, I get a 40% lower value than my number. So keep that in mind. A significant part of the building lies in the foundations and basements. That's another reason why the potential energy isn't as big as I'm estimating. Then there's other things, like the concrete was actually reduced to dust, of course. So as the building was collapsing, some of that energy would have just floated off. Okay, well, I can't account for that. Some of the energy, of course, was actually absorbed in the concrete. It didn't make the steel hotter, it would have made the concrete hotter, or the air hotter. Can't account for that. I'm assuming it all goes into the steel. And the other thing is, of course, the ground, there were tremors when the buildings fell. So, and it rocked other buildings. So some of the energy obviously went into other places. So what's the answer I get? Well, I get an answer of 20 degrees centigrade. That's what I get. If I use NIST's number, I get 8 degrees. Okay? That's for the Twin Towers. That's for the tall ones. If we do the same thing for Building 7, then basically, because it's half the height, assuming that all the composition of the building is the same, so the mass of the building to mass of steel ratio is the same, then we would expect it to be half the amount, so 10 degrees. Okay? Or if I use the NIST number, that would be 4 degrees. So in other words, basically, no. The work done, as far as I can see, I think it's reasonable to say, even though it's a back-of-the-envelope calculation, it's not adding up. Okay? As a little plug, that's my website, by the way. So if you want to read more about what I have to say about 9/11 generally, but this is on it. Okay, so what did NIST have to say? Well, it's interesting. NIST didn't bother doing any of that nonsense with the work. Okay, they did something else altogether. They basically said, if you come down to just a little bit above the red, okay, where the dash is just above the red, and it says, found no evidence that would support the melting of steel in a jet-fueled ignited fire in the towers prior to collapse. Okay? The condition of the steel in the wreckage of World Trade Center towers, brackets, whether it was in a molten state or not, was irrelevant to the investigation of the collapse. Okay? So what they're saying is basically this. We didn't really bother studying the steel in the wreckage, whether it was in a molten state or not, because it couldn't provide any information on its condition prior to the collapse. Okay? It's a bit of a funny way of looking at it, if you ask me. If you want to know why something fell down, you still want to examine it, wouldn't you? That's their answer. What else did they say? I've highlighted what I think is the most important bit in red. It says, any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to high temperatures, and then the bit in red, resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile. Okay, what it's saying here is that the reason that they got molten steel was because when it was in the rubble, it was there for a long time. Well, that doesn't make any sense to a physicist, right? Because things don't get hotter than the thing that's heating them. Now, the fires couldn't have been hotter at the bottom in the pile than they were high up in the building, because in the building, obviously, there was lots of oxygen. In the rubble, there would have been very little oxygen. So you would expect the fires to be a lot less. The amount of time of exposure has absolutely nothing to do with it. I mean, this is just nonsense as far as I can see. So, anyway, that's what NIST say. So I think, the molten steel question is a good one. But then we come to the last one. The close to freefall collapse. And in a way, this is the most obvious one of all. And anyway, there's another physics teacher, David Chandler, who did the work on this, really, as far as I can gather. And he basically, all he did was he just looked at how fast the rate of collapse of Building 7 was. And as a result of that, he basically got NIST to rewrite their analysis, and they came up with this 3-stage collapse, right? Which I'll show you. This is a NIST graph, okay? So if you look at the NIST final report on Building 7, this is the graph that they produced, and it's a velocity against time graph. And what they've done, finally, like any competent A-level student would do, is they've actually put a linear fit to the points, something they never did before. Okay? So they put the fit, and that's a red line running through. And then they do a linear regression to that red line. Okay? And you can see there, it's the equation there. And those of you who are more mathematical will see that the gradient is 32.196, because that's the one multiplied by t. Okay? And if I come back a second. So they basically now have a velocity time graph partially fitted with a straight line indicating constant velocity. Okay? Straight line, constant velocity for more than 2 seconds. And the gradient, 32.196 feet per second squared. They do it in imperial. I translate it. 9.8133. Anybody who does physics will know straight away that's g. That's acceleration due to gravity. Okay? So NIST themselves, with this graph, which is in their final report, admit to freefall collapse for more than 2 seconds of what they claim is a 5-second collapse. That 5-second collapse claim is arguable anyway, but even with that, they're saying nearly half of the collapse was at freefall. Now, how can that be? There's a number of ways of looking at this. If you have something that's moving at freefall, that basically means that there can be only one force acting on that object, and that force is its own weight. Okay? So what this is suggesting is that the part of the building is falling with its own weight and nothing's holding it up. How come? Okay? Or we can look at it this way. We can go back to the conservation of energy, and we can say that this could, if we want free fall, this can only occur if all of the gravitational potential energy is converted into kinetic energy as the thing falls. If any energy is needed for other purposes, then the kinetic energy must be reduced, and so the acceleration would fall below free fall rate. But then, if the energy wasn't used for other purposes, what was it that actually destroyed the building? Okay. I'll come back to Bill Manning, because he said something else I think that's very relevant. This was one article. It was basically a plea to other experts about what was happening to the investigation, really, if you remember. He's basically saying it's a half-baked farce, what's happened to all the material evidence. And he says, as things now stand, if they continue in such a fashion, the investigation into the World Trade Center fire and collapse will amount to paper and computer-generated hypotheticals. Okay, that's exactly where it got to. Okay, which is why I said at the start, FEMA and NIST, they just were dealing with physics. Okay, they didn't have a lot of the material out. Well, FEMA did, but NIST didn't. So what was NIST's final analysis? Well, it relied upon computer simulation. But, amazingly, they didn't actually publicly release what the computer simulation was like. So we know the type of model they used, but we don't know exactly what parameters and so forth they put in. So no one could actually test to see whether NIST results stand up. Why? I mean, you know, where's the national security in this or whatever? This is just a building that collapsed. Surely people should be able to find out. But this is where it stands. Also, partly the same reason, we've only got certain answers, selected outputs, okay? They've picked out the ones they liked, essentially, okay? And none of those actually reproduce freefall. So they've used a model we don't know, and they've selected their own outputs, and none of those actually explain freefall. So NIST basically can't explain what they are stating happened themselves in their own final report. So I'll come back to, this is Shyam Sundar. He was a lead NIST investigator. And this is what he said to David Chandler when he was challenged at the draft report hearing. He said, "Freefall happens only when there are no structural components below the building section of the building, the falling section of the building." Absolutely true. I couldn't agree more. And yet, there's freefall in the graph. So, I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.